Olvir Rosta, also known as Olvir Rosta, is a character within the medieval Orkneyinga saga, who is purported to have lived during the early 12th century. His Old Norse byname, Rosta, means brawl, riot. His name and byname appear variously in English secondary sources. Olvir appears in the saga as the son of Þorljót and Steinnvör the Stout. The mother of Steinnvör is Frakok, who has been described as one of the great villains of the entire saga. One of Frakok's sisters, Helga, is the concubine of Earl Hakon Pálsson. Part of the saga relates of how the earldom of Orkney is for a time jointly run by half-brothers, Haraldur Håkonsson and Paul Håkonsson, who were both sons of Earl Hakon. With the death of Earl Haraldur, son of Helga, Frakok's family falls out of favor and are forced to leave Orkney. In time, Frakok conspires with the father of Earl Ronvaldur and agrees to a plan to take the Orkney by force and split it with Earl Ronvaldur. She and Olvir eventually make the way to the Þorljót and made the return in a bid to win half of the earldom. However, the small fleet of ships are defeated in battle against Earl Paul. The saga also tells of how Olvir kills an Orkney chieftain who fought against him during the sea battle by burning the man to death within his house. The chieftain's vengeful son later tracks down Olvir and Frakok at their own home in Sutherland. After a short battle behind the homestead, Olvir's men are routed and Frakok is burned to death within her house. Olvir flees from the scene, making for the Þorljót, and is not heard from again. Olvir has also been associated with several places in Sutherland, some of which may bear his name. It has been proposed that Olvir Rosta may be an ancestor of either one of two Scottish clans from the Outer Hebridean island of Lewis. In 1962, a runestone was uncovered in the Inner Hebrides which bore the name Olvir. It has been suggested that the men mentioned on this stone were family relations of Olvir. Background: Olvir Rosta is a character in the medieval Orkneyinga saga. His name in Old Norse is Olvir Rosta. The 17th century Icelandic historian Magnus Thorhallson, who wrote Latin histories which covered events the Northern Isles and northeast of Scotland, rendered Olvir's name as Olvir Rosta. Olvir's byname, Rosta, means brawl, riot. Both his name and byname are represented various ways in English secondary sources. The saga describes him as the tallest of men, and strong in limb, exceedingly overbearing, and a great fighter. The Orkneyinga saga states that Olvir was the son of Þorljót from Reykjavik. The 19th century historian Joseph Anderson was of the opinion that Reykjavik likely refers to Raquik on the island of Orkney, or possibly, but less likely, to Raquik on the island of Westre Orkney. The saga states that Olvir's mother was Þorljót's wife, Steinnvör the Stout. Olvir's parents had several other children in the saga, sons Magnus Thorhallson, Eindridi, and daughter Orthilda. Steinnvör's mother is given as Frakok. Her father was Frakok's husband Þorljót Villain from Sutherland. The saga states that Frakok was a daughter of Modern, a wealthy and noble farmer from Idali, Dale. According to 21st century historian Gareth Williams, this probably refers to a dale within the Dales of Caithness. The 21st century historian Barbara Crawford stated that the Dales of Caithness refer to that part of Caithness which includes the river Vallis, running down towards the Pentland Firth. The saga records that another daughter of Modern's was Helga, who was the concubine of the Orcadian Earl Hakon Pálsson, and the mother of the Earl's son, Earl Haraldur Håkonsson. According to the saga, Frakok's brothers included Engus the Generous and Þorljót from Thurso, who is described as a man worthy of honor. The saga declares that the descendants of Modern were high-born and thought a lot of themselves, and Williams suggested that they could be related to a powerful dynasty in the Irish Sea Zone that included an Óttar who seized control of the Kingdom of Dublin in 1142. Williams noted that Frakok appears as one of the great villains of the Orkneyinga saga. Williams noted that while some of Modern's descendants had legitimate claims for the earldom, Frakok did not. However, she made a claim on behalf of her descendants, specifically Olvir. Williams was of the opinion that the power base of Modern and his son Earl Óttar was in Caithness and Sutherland, not in Orkney. The saga states that Frakok held lands which, according to Williams, were located near the modern town of Helmsdale, Sutherland. Williams noted that the saga specifically states that Frakok's husband was from Sutherland, and in consequence, Williams considered that these lands probably passed to her through her marriage. The size of these lands is unknown. Crawford suggested that they covered most of Sutherland, that after the Frakok's death, and the departure of Olvir, the lands were inherited by her relative Erika Steinnvör, and in turn by his son, before passing into the possession of the de Moravia family. In Williams' opinion, Crawford may have exaggerated the extent of these lands somewhat. Williams observed that another base of power for Frakok and Olvir may have been the Þorljót, which can include both the Hebrides and the Isle of Man. The saga states at one point, Frakok and Olvir traveled to the Þorljót to gather ships and men. Later the Þorljót is the destination of Olvir in his last appearance in the saga. Williams noted that the Þorljót appear many times in the sagas as a target for raids and conquests for Orcadian earls, as well as being the source for attacks on the earldom itself. Williams also noted that it is possible that saga's association of Frakok and Olvir with the Þorljót may be a red herring. He stated that, if there was an Orcadian tradition of the Þorljót as a haunt of ne'er-do-wells, this would provide an alternative explanation for the references within Orkneyinga saga, including those to do with Modern's family. Even so, Williams considered that the saga seems to imply that the family had dynastic connections with important individuals of the Þorljót, including Olaf Tidbert, King of Man and the Isles. Orkneyinga saga. The main source for the life of Olvir is the Orkneyinga saga, which was compiled sometime around 1200 by an unknown Icelander. The saga is thought to have been based upon poetry, oral tradition, and other written material. The original version ended with the death of Sven Aslefsson. The saga is considered to become more accurate as events approach the writer's own time. In the late 14th century, the saga was revised and edited and included in the Icelandic Flateyjarbók. The saga can be summed up as an account of the lives of many of the earls of Orkney, from the 9th to 13th centuries. According to research fellow Ian Bueman, the saga is useful not for the specific events it describes, but rather for the ability to learn of the ideas shaping the text during the periods of composition or revision. For example, it is possible that even one of the main characters of the saga, Sven Aslefsson, never existed, or at least it is quite possible that the historical Sven was different from the saga's portrayal of him. Another source which mentions Olvir is Þorljót Torfsson's 17th century history of Orkney, which follows the Orkneyinga saga. Frakok and Helga forced out of Orkney by Earl Paul. The Orkneyinga saga relates how after the death of Earl Hakon Pálsson, his sons, Haraldur Hákonarson and Paul Hákonarson, own sin, divided the earldom between themselves. However, the half-brothers soon began to disagree with one another, and the vassals divided into competing factions. The saga relates how one day Frakok and her sister Helga were sewing a snow-white garment embroidered with gold. This garment was enchanted, and the two sisters had intended it for Earl Harold's half-brother, Earl Paul. Unfortunately for the sisters, Earl Harold noticed the beautiful garment and, despite the protestations, put the garment on and soon after died. The saga states that Earl Paul immediately took control of his deceased half-brother's possessions, and that he was highly suspicious of the two sisters. In consequence, Frakok and Helga were no longer welcome in the earldom, and they left for Caithness, and from the move to Sutherland where Frakok had an estate. In time, several of Frakok's descendants were brought up in Sutherland, including her daughter, Steinnvör the Stout, and grandson Olvir. Alliance with Earl Ronvalder against Earl Paul. The saga relates of how, during an earlier time, Karl Coulson assisted Harold the Jarl in being recognized as an illegitimate son of the deceased Norwegian king, Magnus Barefoot. In consequence, the reigning king, Sigurd Magnusson, was Harold the Gill's half-brother. The Norwegian king appointed Karl as an earl of one half of Orkney, and also had Karl's name changed to Ronvalder. On the death of Sigurd, his son, Magnus Thorhallson, succeeded to the kingdom. When Harold the Jarl learned of Sigurd's death, he gathered his supporters and successfully underwent an ordeal to prove his paternity, and was accepted as king of one half of the kingdom. For 3 years the joint kings maintained an uneasy peace with one another, but on the 4th year hostilities finally broke out. A battle was fought where the vastly outnumbered Harold the Jarl was defeated. In consequence, he fled to the protection of the King of Denmark. The following Yuletide, Harold the Jarl returned to Norway, captured Magnus and maimed him. Harold the Jarl then became king of the entire kingdom. That spring, in recognition for Ronvald's assistance, the king renewed the grant of islands and the title of Earl to Ronvalder. James Gray, who summarized the events depicted within the saga, dated the death of Sigurd Magnusson to the year 1126. He dated the capture and mutilation of Magnus Sigurðarson to 1135. According to the saga, sometime after Harold the Gill's victory over Magnus Sigurðarson, Earl Ronvald's father, Kolr, sent messengers to Earl Paul, demanding that Earl Paul hand over the lands which the Norwegian king had granted to Earl Ronvalder. When Earl Paul refused this, Kolr's messengers proceeded to Caithness, where Frakok lived. The messengers related to Frakok of Kolr's proposal, that if she and Olvir were to defeat Earl Paul, half of the earldom would be theirs. Frakok agreed to the plan, saying that she would attack in midsummer. She promised that during upcoming winter she would gather forces from her kinsmen, friends, and connections in Scotland and the Þorljót for the task. The next winter Earl Ronvalder and 2 of his chiefs, Solmunda and John, gathered a force of men and about 5 or 6 ships for their expedition. The following summer their forces sailed from Norway to Shetland, where they were well received by the local bondsmen. Meanwhile, Frakok and Olvir assembled a small fleet of 12 ships in the Þorljót, although the saga describes the ships as small and poorly manned. At the middle of summer, Frakok and Olvir sailed for Orkney to fulfill the pledge of wresting the earldom from Earl Paul. See Battle against Earl Paul. According to the Orkneyinga saga, when Earl Paul heard of Earl Ronvald's arrival in Shetland, he held council and decided to immediately gather forces and attack Earl Ronvalder before he could be reinforced by the incoming men he knew were coming from the Þorljót. That night Earl Paul was joined by 5 chieftains, with 4 ships. This brings his total forces to 5 ships. The fleet sailed to Rouse, where they arrive at sunset. During the night the force is further strengthened by arriving men. In the morning, as the fleet is about to set out for Shetland to meet Earl Ronvalda, about 10 or 12 ships were spotted coming from the Pentland Firth. Earl Paul and his men were certain these ships were those of Frakok and Olvir. In consequence, the Earl ordered the fleet to intercept. The saga states that when Olvir's ships were east of Tankernes, they then sailed west from Mull's Head, Deerness. By this time, Earl Paul was further strengthened by a chieftain from Tankernes. The Earl then ordered his ships to be bound together, and for a bondi to gather stones for the upcoming battle. When the Earl and his troops have fully prepared themselves, the saga states that Olvir's forces made their attack. Although the saga states that the forces of Olvir were superior in numbers to those of Earl Paul, it also notes that Olvir's ships were smaller. Olvir brought his own ship up next to the Earl's, where the fighting was the fiercest. One of the Earl's chieftains, Olvir Rosta, attacked Olvir's smallest ships, and cleared 3 of them in a short time. Olvir urged his men forward and was the first to board Earl Paul's own ship. When he spotted Earl Paul, Olvir threw a spear at him, and although it was blocked by a shield, the force of the blow knocked the Earl onto the deck. With the fall of Earl Paul, a great shout goes up, but just at that moment, one of the Earl's best men, Sven Breastrope, hurled a large stone at Olvir, hitting him square in the chest and knocked him overboard. Although Olvir's men dragged him from the water, it was unclear to the battlers whether he lived or not. Olvir's disheartened men were driven off the Earl's ship and began to withdraw. Olvir eventually recovered his wits but was unable to rally his troops. The battle was lost. Earl Paul pursued Olvir's fleeing fleet into the Pentland Firth, before giving up the chase. 5 of Olvir's ships were left behind, and were captured and manned by the forces loyal to Earl Paul. The Earl is later further strengthened by 2 longships, and his forces swells to 12 ships. The next day, Earl Paul sailed to Shetland, where he destroyed Earl Ronvald's fleet. Although Earl Ronvald's forces remained on Shetland itself, Earl Paul successfully held onto the earldom. Gray stated that these battles were fought in the year 1136. Burning of Olaf Rolfsson. The Orkneyinga saga states that 3 days before Yule, Olvir and his band of men arrived in Duncansby. Williams stated that the farm of Duncansby, located near the Dales of Caithness, was then in hands of an Orkney chieftain, Olaf Rolfsson. Joshua Prescott stated that Olaf appears to have been Earl Paul's main supporter in Caithness. According to Williams, Olaf appears to have held these lands directly from the Earls of Orkney, rather than as a family possession. The saga relates of how at Duncansby, Olvir and his party surprised Olaf within his own house. They then set fire to the house, and burned Olaf to death within. Olvir and his men took all the movable property they could get their hands on, before leaving the scene. When Earl Paul heard of what has happened, he takes in the slain chieftain's son, Sven Olafsson. With the death of his father, Sven Olafsson becomes known as Sven Aslefarsson, after his mother. Such house burnings, in which individuals are burned to death, or slain as they flee the fire, are found throughout the sagas as a part of blood feuds. The saga states that sometime later, Sven, who has spent time in the Southreya and Athel, returned to Orkney. On his way, he stopped at Thurso, where his accomplice, Jotolf, negotiated a truce between Sven and Frakok's brother, Earl Ottar. The Earl paid Sven compensation for the death of Olaf, and promised his friendship. In return, Sven promised to aid Earl Ottar's relative Erlinda Haraldsson in a possible bid for the earldom of Orkney. Defeat of Olvir, and the burning of Frakok. The saga states that sometime later, Sven approached Earl Ronvalda, and asked the Earl for men and ships to take vengeance upon Olvir and Frakok, who were involved in the burning of his father. The Earl consented to this request, and gave Sven 2 ships. Sven travelled south to Borgarfjord, and then west to the trading place of Defera. According to Anderson, Borgarfjord may refer to the Moray Firth, and Defera likely refers to the shore in the parish of Duffus, on the coast of Moray. The saga states that from Defera, Sven travelled to Ecclesbackie, and from the went to Athol, where he met Earl Madda. Anderson stated that Ecclesbackie, in this case, likely refers to the coast on the Moray Firth, next to Athol. The 19th century historian William Forbes Skene agreed with this, specifically locating it to Findhorn, where ships could enter an estuary and follow a route into Athol. However, Herman Paulsen and Paul Jeffrey Edwards, in the 1981 translation of the saga, identify the town of Banff with Defera, and the river Oikel with Ecclesbackie. The saga then relates how the Earl Maddath gave Sven guides, and how Sven travelled through the interior of the country, over mountains, and through woods, away from inhabited areas, until he came upon Strathelmsdale, near where Olvir and Frakok live. Williams stated that since the saga records that Sven approached the area by land, the site of Olvir and Frakok's estate was probably located somewhere in the Dale of Helmsdale, not where the modern village is situated on the coast. Williams also noted that this area was quite remote from Orkney, and that it may have been outside of the control of the earldom. The saga states that Olvir and Frakok had spies on the lookout. However, because of the route taken by Sven, they were unaware of his presence until Sven occupied a certain slope behind the homestead. The saga states that Olvir and 60 of his men confronted Sven, although Þormald Uttorfsson's account of the incident gives 40. After a short clash, the saga states that Olvir's men soon gave way, and many were killed in the ensuing rout. Olvir survived the clash, and fled up Helmsdale River. Meanwhile, Sven and his men continued on towards the houses. The area was plundered, and the houses were burned to the ground with their inmates still inside, and in this way Frakok perished. The saga states that Sven and his men committed many ravages in Sutherland before returning home. Upon reaching the river, Olvir fled through the mountains, and is last heard making for the Southreya. He is not mentioned again within the Orkneyinga saga. Later on within the saga, another of Frakok's grandsons, Thorbjorn Clark, who is a brother-in-law and close friend of Sven, has 2 of Sven's men killed for their part in the burning, while the saga records that Frakok was killed to avenge the burning of Olaf. Recently, scholars Angelo Forte, Richard Oram, and Frederick Pedsen stated that her fate was actually sealed by her support of Erlinda Haraldsson's bid for the earldom over the claim of Haraldur Maddatharsson. Haraldur was the son of Earl Maddath and Margrave Hakonardottir. Margrave was a niece of Frakok, and Earl Maddath was possibly a cousin of the David I. The union between Earl Maddath and Margrave benefited the Scottish crown by increasing Scottish influence in the north at the expense of Norwegian influence. Also, in the 1120s and 1130s, David I had faced challenges to his authority. A large part of the support for these challenges came from Moray and Ross. These lands were directly between the northern lands of Caithness and Orkney, and David's strength to the south. According to the Forte Oram and Pedsen, the prospect of having the son of one of his northern supporters as the Earl of Caithness was too good for the king to pass up, especially since Haraldur was still a minor, and would thus be under the direction of an appointed tutor. As it turned out, the installation of Haraldur as an Earl of Orkney and Caithness was a triumph for the Scottish crown. In the 1140s 1440s, Sutherland and Caithness were further integrated into the kingdom, and the Norwegian influence in Orkney was neutralized. Locations associated with Olvir, Frakok, and Sven. Several writers have noted a place which is said to be the location of the burning. The Cantmore website states that a supposed castle in which Frakok was burned may be located at grid reference NC 872-8, near Cumbrace, within the parish of Culloden. In 1769, Thomas Pennant noted the episode of the burning, and stated that certain ruins at Cumbrace were called Cairnshuan, and that these were the remnants of the homestead that Sven burned. Rev. Sage, in his account of the parish in the Statistical Account of Scotland, noted the ruins mentioned by Pennant. He called them Cairnsuan, and translated this to Old Cairns. Sage, however, noted Þorljót Torfsson's account of the burning, and suggested that a possibly more accurate etymology is Suinsfield. Pennant stated that, though the ruins are great, yet no man can tell of what kind they were, that is, whether round like Pictish houses, or not. According to the Cantmore website, Pennant may have been referring to any of the chambered cairns in the area. The site of the supposed castle was visited by the Ordnance Survey in 1961, but no evidence of it was found. In the mid-19th century, Alexander Pope noted Cairnsuan and stated that nearby there were certain ruins called Shukarn-Olvir. Pope also stated that to the southwest of this location there was a part of Helmsdale River called Avon-Olvir. Another location he connected with Olvir was a hill in the forest of Sletty called Cragan-Olvir.